Blood and bullets might build an empire, but bad translations will burn it to the ground. Victor Hale was watching a billion-dollar deal dissolve in real time because his suited-up Ivy League interpreter couldn't tell a polite compromise from a subtle death threat. The boardroom was suffocating. The money was bleeding out, and then a quiet voice cut through the heavy silence. It didn't come from a mobster, a lawyer, or a rival. It came from the girl pouring the water. The financial hemorrhage didn't start with a bang. It started with a misplaced comma, a misunderstood inflection, a wrong word in an email chain that spanned 3 time zones. Victor Hale sat at the head of a 14-feet walnut table, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The spreadsheets projected on the far wall were glowing a malignant red. It was quarter midnight on a Tuesday. The city below his penthouse office was a grid of indifferent amber lights, oblivious to the fact that Victor's logistics network was quietly imploding. Organized crime in the 21st century rarely looked like it did in the movies. Nobody was leaving severed horse heads in beds. They were leaving shipping containers full of heavily taxed cargo rotting in international ports. "Walk me through the Berlin intercept again," Victor said. His voice was entirely flat. It wasn't the shout of a man losing control. It was the terrifying hollow tone of a man calculating the exact weight of a failure. Simon, his chief operating officer, swallowed hard. Simon was a numbers guy, allergic to violence, but addicted to the proximity of power. Right now, he looked like he wanted to jump through the plate glass window. "The German syndicate pulled out of the Baltic route," Simon said, tapping his tablet. "They claimed we insulted their primary distributor, something about a breach of protocol in last week's summit." "An insult," Victor repeated. He didn't look at Simon. He looked at the empty leather chair where his former interpreter used to sit, right before Victor had him escorted out of the building permanently. "We offered them a 10% bump on their distribution fee." "How does a 10% raise translate to an insult?" "The dialect," Simon murmured, wiping his brow. "The interpreter we hired, he used High German, formal, stiff. He mistranslated your colloquialisms. When you said we were cutting them in on the ground floor, the phrasing he chose implied we were treating them like bottom feeders, like entry-level grunts." Victor closed his eyes. $800 million in projected revenue. Stalled at a dock in Hamburg because a guy with a master's degree in linguistics didn't know the difference between a partnership and a put-down. It was the third deal this month to go sideways. The Russian expansion was currently frozen because of a similar screw-up regarding port tariffs. Victor was losing billions, not to the feds, not to rival families, but to the simple, maddening barrier of human language. In the corner of the room, a spray bottle hissed. Clara Bennett wiped down the glass paneling of the liquor cabinet with methodical circular motions. She smelled like industrial lemon bleach and cheap lavender soap. She was practically invisible, dressed in the dark, gray uniform of the building's nighttime janitorial staff. She wasn't supposed to be in the room during a meeting, but Victor's meetings lately bled into the early hours of the morning, and the cleaning company had a strict schedule. Victor didn't mind her presence. To him, she was part of the HVAC system, background noise, a function of the room. Clara preferred it that way. Invisibility was safety. Safety was a steady paycheck. And a steady paycheck meant she could keep her younger brother in a physical therapy clinic that didn't smell like urine and despair. She moved to the credencer, gathering up the empty crystal tumblers. As she passed behind Victor's chair, she caught a glimpse of the Russian contracts scattered across the table. Her eyes tracked the Cyrillic text. She paused for a fraction of a second, noting a glaring discrepancy in the indemnification clause, before stacking the glasses and moving on. She knew who Victor Hale was. Everyone who worked in the building knew. You didn't ask questions about the armed men in the lobby, and you didn't look at the spreadsheets. You cleaned the blood off the carpets if you were paid extra, and you kept your mouth shut. "We have the meeting with Volkov tomorrow," Simon said, breaking the silence. "He's flying in from St. Petersburg. If we don't lock down the northern shipping lanes, the supply chain dries up by November. We need this, Victor. Who do we have translating?" Victor asked, finally looking away from the red numbers. "A new guy, top of his class at Georgetown, speaks fluent Russian, understands corporate law." "Does he understand extortion?" Victor asked plainly. "Does he understand that Volkov is a paranoid psychopath who looks for disrespect in a sneeze?" "He's the best the agency had," Simon said defensively. Victor let out a slow, measured breath. "Have him here at 8. Clara loaded her cart. The wheels squeaked faintly as she pushed it towards the heavy double doors. She didn't look back. It wasn't her problem. Let the men in expensive suits lose their money. She had a bathroom on the 7th floor that needed grouting. The next evening, the boardroom air felt thick enough to chew. The air conditioning was humming at full blast, but Colin, the new Georgetown interpreter, was sweating through his bespoke collar. Across the table sat Anton Vulov. He was a man made of right angles and bad intentions, possessing a quiet physical density that seemed to warp the gravity in the room. He didn't speak a word of English. He didn't have to. The two massive men standing behind him did enough communicating with their posture. Victor sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table. Tell him, Victor said to Colin, that the tariffs at the port are our responsibility. We absorb the cost, but we require a 7,030 split on the container turnaround. Colin swallowed audibly. He turned to Volov and began speaking in rapid textbook Russian. Clara was in the room again. She was standing by the corner bar, refilling the ice buckets. She hadn't wanted to be here. She had tried to slip out when Volkov's men arrived, but one of the guards had blocked the door and locked it from the inside, unwilling to let anyone move during the negotiation. So, she made herself small. She focused on the ice. Clink, clink, clink. She listened to Colin's translation. Her hand stalled over the ice bucket. Colin hadn't used the Russian business term for absorb the cost. He had used a phrasing that loosely translated to, we will take the burden because you cannot. It was a subtle phrasing, but in the hyper-masculine, ego-driven world of the Russian brat, it was an insult, a handout. Volkov's eyes narrowed. The faint smirk that had been resting on his face evaporated. He leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking sharply in the quiet room. He fired back a response in Russian. The words were low, grelly, and laced with absolute venom. Colin turned back to Victor, his face pale. He says he appreciates the generous offer, but he feels the 7,030 split is a bit steep given the current market. Clara closed her eyes. Idiot. Volov hadn't said that at all. Volkov had just said, if you think I am a beggar needing your charity, I will choke your shipping lanes with the bodies of your crew, 50/50ths or the docks burn. Tell him. Victor said, his voice dropping a dangerous octave, completely unaware of the threat he had just received. That 7,030 is non-negotiable. I am already doing him a favor by taking on the port authority. He takes the deal, or we find another partner. Clara watched Colin hesitate. The young interpreter was out of his depth. He didn't know how to translate Victor's hardline stance without escalating the tension, especially since he had completely missed Volkov's death threat. Collins stammered, then turned to Vulov and spoke. He tried to soften Victor's words. He pleaded using conciliatory language. Volkov slammed his fist onto the table. The coffee cups rattled violently. Vulov stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with sharp, angry movements. He spat a final sentence in Russian and turned towards the door. What did he say? Victor demanded, standing up. Colin, what the hell did he just say? Colin was shaking. He said the deal is off. He's leaving. Victor's jaw tightened. $1 billion gone. The entire northern route up in smoke because this sweating child couldn't manage a simple negotiation. Victor reached for his phone, preparing to call his people at the docks to brace for a turf war. Excuse me. The voice was soft, but it cut through the room like a gunshot. Victor stopped. Simon froze. Vulov, halfway to the door, paused and looked over his shoulder. Everyone turned to look at the corner bar. Clara was standing there, a pair of stainless steel ice tongs still in her hand. Her heart was beating frantically against her ribs, a trapped bird in a cage, but her face was entirely blank. She set the tongs down on the granite counter. The small metal click echoed loudly. You can't let him leave, Clara said. She looked directly at Victor. Victor stared at her. It took him a moment to even register who she was. The cleaning girl. What did you say? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I said, you can't let him leave. Clara stepped away from the bar. She wiped her damp hands on her apron. Your interpreter didn't tell you what Mr. Vulov actually said, and he didn't tell Mr. Vulov what you actually meant. Colin turned purple. Are you insane? Security, get her out of here. Shut up, Colin, Victor snapped, his eyes never leaving Clara. Speak. Clara took a breath. When you offered to absorb the port tariffs, your interpreter made it sound like a charity handout. He insulted Mr. Vulov's financial sovereignty. In response, Mr. Vulov didn't say the split was steep. He threatened to murder your crew and burn the docks unless you gave him a 50/50 split. Simon gasped. Victor's eyes turned to chips of ice. He looked at Colin. The interpreter was shrinking into his suit, his silence a damning confession. And just now, Clara continued, her voice steadying. When you told him 7,030 was non-negotiable, your interpreter begged him. He sounded weak. Mr. Volkov doesn't respect weakness. He just said that he will enjoy tearing your empire apart, piece by piece. Vulov was staring at Clara. He took a step back toward the table, his head tilted in curiosity. Victor looked at the man, then back to the maid. You speak Russian. I speak 6 languages fluently, Mr. Hale, Clara said. And I know the difference between a corporate merger and a declaration of war. If you let him walk out that door thinking you're a weak man trying to give him charity, you will lose a lot more than your shipping route. The room held its breath. Victor Hale was a man who lived by calculated risks. He looked at the trembling Georgetown graduate, and then he looked at the woman in the cheap apron who hadn't blinked once. Tell him, Victor said to Clara. Tell him what? Fix it, Clara turned to Vulov. She didn't cower, she didn't soften her posture, she spoke in perfect colloquial Russian. Her accent was flawless, bearing the harsh, clipped consonants of the St. Petersburg underground. Mr. Hale apologizes for the idiot in the suit, Clara said in Russian. He doesn't offer charity. He offered to handle the Port Authority because our infrastructure is better suited to mask the bribes. It is a tactical advantage, not a handout. However, 7,030 is a victor's tax. Mr. Hale suggests 60/40ths. You keep your pride, we keep the docks running, and nobody has to burn anything down tonight. Vulov blinked. He looked from Clara Rai to Victor, then let out a sharp, barking laugh. It was a terrifying sound, loud and abrasive. He fired back in Russian. The little mouse has teeth, 60/40ths. But if your bribes fail, I take his head. Clara Rai turned to Victor. He accepts 6,040, but he holds you personally responsible if the Port Authority catches on. Victor held Vulov's gaze and gave a single firm nod. Volkov smiled, a grim, terrifying showing of teeth, and nodded back. The Russian gestured to his men, and they walked back to the table. Vulov pulled a gold pen from his inner pocket and signed the contract on the final page. He tossed the pen onto the wood, tapped the paper twice, and walked out of the room, his men trailing behind him. The heavy doors clicked shut. Silence descended on the boardroom. Colin was weeping silently into his hands. Simon was leaning against the wall, clutching his chest as if checking for a bullet hole. Victor Hale remained standing. He looked down at the signed contract. 6,040. It wasn't the 70 he wanted, but it was a hell of a lot better than 0. It saved the quarter. It saved the route. He looked up. Clara Rai was already back at the bar, quietly loading the dirty ice buckets onto her squeaking cart. Colin, Victor said softly. The interpreter looked up, terrified. Mr. Hale, I swear the idioms, leave. If I ever see you in this city again, you won't need an interpreter to understand what happens next. Colin didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled out of his chair, grabbed his briefcase and practically sprinted out the door. Simon, process the contract, then get out, Victor ordered. Yes, Victor, right away. Simon grabbed the paperwork and vanished, closing the doors softly behind him. Victor was finally alone with the maid. He slowly walked over to the corner bar. He was a tall man and impeccably dressed in a dark tailored suit that hid the scars of his early days in the life. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator. Clara didn't stop working. She sprayed a rag with glass cleaner and began wiping down the counter. Stop, Victor said. She stopped. She didn't look at him, keeping her eyes on her hands. Who are you? Victor asked. Clara Bennett. I work for Apex Cleaning Solutions. My shift ends at 4 a.m. Don't play stupid with me, Clara Bennett. People who work for Apex Cleaning don't speak flawless St. Petersburg Russian and negotiate mafia port treaties while pouring ice. Clara finally looked up. Her eyes were tired. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the bottom of the world and was exhausted from climbing out. I lived in Moscow for 4 years, then Beijing for 3. I have a master's in international relations, and you clean my toilets. The world doesn't pay for degrees, Mr. Hale. It pays for leverage. I didn't have any. My father died owing a very bad man a lot of money. I needed cash entirely off the books so my wages wouldn't be garnished by predatory creditors. Apex doesn't ask for a social security number, and they pay in cash. Victor studied her face. He was looking for the lie. In his world, everyone lied. They lied for money, for power, for survival. But Claria's pulse was steady at her throat. She wasn't trying to charm him. She looked entirely annoyed that her routine had been disrupted. You've been listening, Victor realized. He thought back to the past 3 months, the failed German deal, the botched Italian shipment. You were in the room during the Berlin calls. I was polishing the floorboards. You knew what they were saying. You knew the translation was wrong. Why didn't you speak up then? You didn't ask me to. Clara said flatly. And you weren't about to get shot by the Germans. Mr. Vulov was 30 seconds away from ordering his men to draw their weapons. I hate blood. It stains the carpets, and I'm the one who has to scrub it out. Victor actually let out a short, quiet breath that might have been a laugh. It was a sound he hadn't made in a long time. He leaned against the bar, crossing his arms. I lost 800 million on the German deal, Victor said. You lost 900, Clara corrected. Your interpreter missed the clause about the fuel search charges. Victor's jaw locked. He stared at her, assessing her value. She was sharp, unflinching, invisible. She understood nuance, tone, and context, the holy trinity of communication that his Ivy League morons kept failing at. Quit your job, Victor said. Clara gripped her rag tightly. No, I beg your pardon. No, Clara repeated, her voice hardening. I know who you are, Mr. Hale. I know what you do. I'm a maid. I stay in the shadows. I don't get involved in cartel politics. Tonight was an exception because I didn't want to get caught in a crossfire. Tomorrow I go back to Grout. Victor reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver money clip. He didn't peel off bills. He tossed the entire clip onto the granite counter. It hit with a heavy thud. It had to be $10,000 in hundreds. That's for tonight, Victor said. Tomorrow you don't wear an apron. You sit at the table. I'm paying you 20,000 a week in cash. You get a secure apartment, a driver, and absolute protection. Clara looked at the stack of money. 20,000 a week. It would pay off her father's debt in a month. It would get her brother out of the state facility and into a private care center. It was life-changing, dangerous, blood-soaked money. She looked from the cash to Victor's face. His expression was unreadable, a mask of pure, pragmatic business. He wasn't making a pass at her. He wasn't saving her. He was buying a tool he desperately needed. 25, Clara said. Victor's eyebrow twitched. Excuse me, 25,000. And you pay my brother's medical bills directly through a shell company so it doesn't trace back to me. She stepped forward, closing the distance slightly, looking him dead in the eye. If I sit at that table, I'm a target. I know too much. I become your weakness. If I'm taking on that risk, I get paid for it. Victor Hale looked at the woman in the gray uniform. For the first time in years, he didn't see a threat, a liability, or an enemy. He saw an equal deal. Victor said, Be here tomorrow at noon. We're calling the Germans back. The $25,000 cleared into a newly established offshore holding account by 900 a.m. Clara stood in the center of a high-end boutique downtown, staring at herself in the three-way mirror. She didn't look like a mafia operative. She looked like a corporate mercenary. Victor's people had arranged the appointment. The instruction to the stylist was simple: armor. She wore a charcoal gray tailored suit cut sharp at the shoulders, paired with a high-necked silk blouse in stark white. The fabric cost more than her car. The shoes were matte black leather, low-heeled, designed for standing on marble floors for hours without flinching. She looked cold, expensive, and entirely untouchable. She missed her apron. The apron was camouflage. This suit was a target painted directly on her back. By noon, she was sitting in the same leather chair Colin, the Georgetown graduate, had occupied the night before. The air in the boardroom smelled of ozone and expensive espresso. Simon sat to her left, vibrating with nervous energy. Victor sat at the head of the table. He hadn't said a word to her since she walked in. He just gave her a single evaluating nod, acknowledging the armor, and dialed the encrypted conference line. The screen on the far wall flared to life. Klaus Richter, the head of the Berlin syndicate, appeared. He was a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed silver beard and the impatient scowl of someone who hated dealing with Americans. Mr. Hale, Ritter said in heavily accented English. I am surprised you called. I assumed our business was concluded after your creative interpretation of our last agreement. Victor leaned forward, steepling his fingers. Mr. Richter, there was a breakdown in communication regarding the Baltic route. I've restructured my translation department to ensure absolute clarity moving forward. This is Miss Bennett. Ritter's eyes flicked to Clara through the camera. He looked entirely unimpressed. He switched immediately to German, a fast, aggressive dialect meant to bulldoze the listener. I don't care if you hired the Pope to translate. Hale, your previous offer insulted my logistics team. We are not your subsidiaries. We are partners. You demanded an auditing clause that would give your people oversight of our Hamburg warehouses. That is unacceptable. Clara didn't take notes. She let the silence hang for exactly 3 seconds, asserting control over the pacing of the room. Then she turned to Victor. He's still angry about the auditing clause, Clara said softly in English. Your previous interpreter used the German legal term for subpoena-level inspection. It made it sound like you were sending the federal police to raid his warehouses, not accountants to verify the ledgers. He feels his autonomy was threatened. Victor's jaw tightened. Tell him the audit is strictly financial. It's a blind ledger review. We don't touch his cargo. We don't look in his crates. We just verify the cash flow. If he wants the 10% bump, I need the financial audit. It's standard. Clara nodded. She looked back at the screen and spoke in German, but she didn't just translate Victor's words. She translated his intent, wrapping it in the precise cultural syntax RT needed to hear. Herr RT Clara began, her voice calm, respectful, but incredibly firm. Mr. Hale recognizes that the previous phrasing was profoundly disrespectful. It was a failure of our staff who has since been terminated. He does not want to inspect your cargo. The Hamburg docks are your kingdom. He only requires a blind reconciliation of the monetary ledgers to satisfy our mutual investors. It is an administrative formality, not an invasion of your sovereign territory. RTOR paused. The word sovereign caught his attention. It fed his ego perfectly. A blind reconciliation, RTOR asked in German. No physical inspections of the containers. None, Clarengian replied smoothly. Your men pack the crates. We simply count the paper. In exchange, the 10% increase in your distribution fee remains on the table. It is a gesture of continued respect for the Berlin operation. RTO leaned back in his chair. The hostility slowly drained from his posture. He looked at Clarengian, then at Victor. He switched back to English. Mr. Hale, your new translator is much more precise. Send the revised contracts with the blind reconciliation phrasing. If the legal team approves, we will unfreeze the Baltic route by Friday. Glad we could reach an understanding, Klaus, Victor said flatly. The screen went black. Simon let out a breath that sounded like a deflating tire. Jesus Christ, he bought it. He didn't buy anything, Clara said, straightening her cuffs. He was offered a bridge to walk back his pride without looking weak to his lieutenants. German business culture relies heavily on compartmentalized authority. By conceding the physical warehouses to him, you gave him a victory to take back to his men while you still get your financial oversight. Victor turned to look at her. His dark eyes were unreadable. He had spent his entire life commanding men who used violence as their first and only tool. He was used to blunt instruments. Clara was a scalpel. She had just salvaged a $900 million logistics network without raising her voice. You really do understand the mechanics of this, Victor said. And it wasn't a compliment. It was an observation of a dangerous fact. I understand leverage, Clara replied. She stood up, picking up a slim leather portfolio. I reviewed the upcoming schedule. You have a call with the Marseille faction at 4, the French Corsicans. I need to brief you on their specific protocols regarding territory disputes. They don't negotiate like the Russians or the Germans. Victor remained seated. Sit down, Clara. She froze. The tone was not a request. It was the heavy, immovable voice of the man who ran the eastern seaboard. She slowly lowered herself back into the leather chair. Simon nervously gathered his tablet. I'll just go get those contracts drafted. He practically sprinted from the room, leaving them alone. Victor stared at her for a long time. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. You negotiated $25,000 a week, he finally said. And medical care for your brother Ben, isn't it? Clara felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit her stomach. You looked into me. I am trusting you with the vocal cords of my empire. Did you think I wouldn't pull every file on your existence? Victor reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto the polished wood table. It had slid to a stop inches from her hands. Ben Bennett, 22, paralyzed from the waist down in a car accident 3 years ago. The same accident that killed your father, who was deeply indebted to a loan shark named Arthur Reed. Clara's hands tightened into fists in her lap. Her perfectly tailored suit suddenly felt like a cage. I pay Reed his interest on time every month. Not anymore, Victor said. Clara's heart stopped. What did you do? I bought the debt. Victor leaned back, his eyes locked onto hers. Reed works in my city. He operates under my umbrella. I had him transfer the paper to me this morning. You don't owe Arthur Reed a dime. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. It wasn't relief. It was raw, suffocating terror. Owning a debt to a street-level thug like Reed was dangerous. Owning a debt to Victor Hale was indentured servitude. I didn't ask you to do that, she said, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts. You are my voice now, Clara. My voice cannot be compromised by a bottom-feeding loan shark looking to squeeze you for extra interest. You work for me, only me. Your brother is being moved to the Vanguard private clinic as we speak. Best neurological care on the coast. And what happens when I decide to quit? she asked bitterly. You won't, Victor said simply, because you are finally exactly where you belong. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the brass handle. Briefing on the Corsicans in my private office in 20 minutes. Don't be late. 2 months blurred into a high-stakes marathon of private jets, bulletproof SUVs, and midnight negotiations in windowless rooms. Clara ceased to be just an interpreter. She became the filter through which Victor Hale engaged with the world. She caught the subtle threats from the Colombians, smoothed over the bruised egos of the Yakuza delegates in Tokyo, and navigated the treacherous poetic doublespeak of the Sicilian Old Guard. She was indispensable, and she was exhausted. It was 3 a.m. somewhere over the Atlantic. The interior of the Gulfstream G650 was dim, lit only by the warm amber reading lights and the glow of Clara's laptop screen. The constant hum of the engines was a white noise that usually put her to sleep, but tonight her mind was a spinning top of tariffs, customs bribes, and territorial maps. She rubbed her eyes, feeling the grit behind her lenses. She looked across the narrow aisle. Victor was awake. He was staring out the window into the pitch-black void of the sky. He had a glass of scotch in one hand, the ice long melted into a tepid puddle. He had taken his suit jacket off hours ago, his tie loosened, the top two buttons of his shirt undone. For a man who controlled billions, he always looked like he was bracing for a physical blow. The tension never left his shoulders. But tonight there was a gray pall to his skin. He was rubbing his left ribs absently, a slow rhythmic motion that spoke of deep old pain. Clara closed her laptop. The click echoed in the quiet cabin. Victor didn't look away from the window. Did you finish the projections for the Marseille port an hour ago? Clara said. Her voice was raspy from disuse. They want a steeper cut of the incoming freight. I flagged the clauses where they tried to hide the extra fees. We can push back on Section 4 during the sit-down tomorrow. Good. The silence returned. Clara should have opened the laptop back up. She should have reviewed the files again. She was an employee, a very highly paid, deeply compromised employee, but the exhaustion had stripped away the rigid professional boundaries she fought so hard to maintain. When was the last time you slept for more than 3 hours? Clara asked. Victor finally turned his head. His dark eyes were heavy, entirely devoid of the terrifying sharpness he wielded in the boardrooms. I don't sleep, Clara. I wait for the sun to come up. That's a very dramatic way of saying you have insomnia. The corner of his mouth twitched, a ghost of a smile. I have enemies. Insomnia is just a byproduct of keeping them alive. He took a slow sip of the watered-down scotch. He grimaced slightly as he set the glass down, his hand instinctively going back to his left rib cage. Shrapnel? Clara asked quietly, watching the movement. Victor looked at his own hand as if surprised to find it there. He dropped it to his lap. Bullet 10 years ago, before the pinnace and the private jets, back when I had to collect debts in person. It cracked the rib, nicked the lung. The weather changes, or I sit in a pressurized cabin too long, and it aches. It was the most personal piece of information he had ever volunteered. Clara felt a strange shift in the cabin's gravity. The space between them felt incredibly narrow. Why do you do it? She asked. The question slipped out before her brain could catch it. You have billions. You have legal fronts. You could walk away. Go live on an island where nobody speaks Russian or German. Victor leaned his head back against the leather seat. He stared at the velvet ceiling of the jet. You don't walk away from a machine this big, Clara. You keep feeding it, or it eats you. If I step down, my lieutenants go to war over the scraps. The streets turn into a slaughterhouse. I maintain order. The money is just the grease that keeps the wheels turning. He rolled his head to look at her. Why do you do it? Your brother is taken care of. His trust fund is fully funded. You could disappear tomorrow. Clara swallowed hard. She looked down at her hands. The calluses from years of scrubbing floors were starting to fade, replaced by the smooth skin of someone who only handled paper and iPads. Because I like it, she whispered. The confession tasted like ash, but it was true. She hated the violence. She hated the fear, but she was addicted to the leverage. She was addicted to sitting in a room full of dangerous, powerful men and knowing she was the smartest person at the table. She controlled the flow of information. She controlled the reality of the negotiations. Victor's eyes darkened. He didn't look repulsed. He looked like a man who had finally found someone speaking his native language. He reached across the narrow aisle. His large, rough hand covered hers where it rested on the armrest. The physical contact was a shock to her system. His skin was warm, the grip heavy and possessive. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The boundary line between boss and employee, between captor and asset, blurred into something infinitely more dangerous. Clara didn't pull her hand away. She let him anchor her in the dark. The illusion of safety shattered in Montreal. They were meeting with Ala Muro, the head of the French Corsican syndicate. Morrow was a brutalist disguised as an aristocrat. He ran the eastern Canadian ports, a vital choke point for Victor's European supply chain. The meeting was set in a private dining room at a hyper-exclusive restaurant in the old city. The walls were lined with velvet, the tables set with heavy silver and crystal. It felt like a tomb. Clara sat to Victor's right, wearing a midnight blue dress that felt uncomfortably restrictive. Victor sat in stoic silence, exuding a quiet, lethal authority. Two of his heavily armed guards stood outside the velvet doors. Morrow arrived late. It was a power play. He swept into the room, flanked by three massive men who looked like they chewed glass for breakfast. Morrow himself was tall, painfully thin, with hollow cheeks and eyes that gleamed with malicious amusement. He didn't look at Victor. He looked directly at Clara. He sat down, poured himself a glass of wine, and spoke in rapid gutter street French. It wasn't the elegant Parisian French Clara had studied at university. It was the dirty, slang-heavy dialect of the Marseilles docks. "So this is the famous pet," Morrow said, smiling thinly at Clara. "The little bird who sings the boss's songs. I heard Hale replaced his entire diplomatic wing with a piece of skirt." Clara's face remained a mask of polite indifference. She didn't flush, she didn't blink. She turned to Victor. "Mr. Morrow expresses his greetings," Clara said in calm English. "He is pleased to make your acquaintance and acknowledges the recent restructuring of our team." Morrow laughed. It was an ugly grating sound. He leaned across the table, his eyes locked on Clara, deliberately ignoring Victor's presence. He switched to heavily accented English. "You translate very cleanly, little bird, but do you translate the dirt? Tell your master that the tariff on the Montreal docks is going up 20%, and if he doesn't like it, my men will start sinking his containers in the St. Lawrence River." He immediately switched back to French, his voice dropping into a guttural, menacing purr meant only for Clara. "And tell him that if he wants to keep his supply lines open, he should leave you here with me for the weekend. I want to see how many languages you can scream in." The temperature in the room plummeted. Clara felt a cold sweat break out at the base of her neck. This wasn't a negotiation, it was an ambush. Morrow was intentionally trying to humiliate Victor by attacking his translator, proving that Victor couldn't protect his own assets. She had to de-escalate, she had to filter it. Clara turned to Victor. Her voice was steady, but her pulse was deafening in her ears. "Mr. Morrow is demanding a 20% increase on the dock tariffs. He is threatening to sabotage the containers if his demands aren't met. He is employing aggressive posturing." Victor didn't look at Clara. His eyes were fixed on Morrow. "What was the second part?" Clara hesitated. "It was just a provocation, Victor. Insults. It's not relevant to the contract. Translate it, Clara," Victor said. His voice was a flat, dead calm that terrified her more than Morrow's threats. Clara looked down at her hands. "He suggested that to keep the supply lines open, you should leave me with him for the weekend. He made a violent sexual threat." The silence that followed was absolute. Morrow smirked, taking a sip of his wine, pleased with the chaos he had injected into the room. He looked at Victor, waiting for the American to lose his temper, waiting for the screaming match that would give Morrow the upper hand. Victor didn't scream. He didn't even raise his voice. Victor reached across the table with terrifying speed. He grabbed the heavy crystal wine decanter by its neck. In one fluid, brutal motion, he swung it downward, smashing it directly into the side of Morrow's head. The crystal shattered with a sickening crunch. Red wine and blood exploded across the pristine white tablecloth. Morrow went down hard, his chair tipping over, crashing to the floor. His three guards reacted instantly, reaching into their jackets for their weapons. But Victor was already moving. He vaulted the table, his own weapon drawn from a shoulder holster before Morrow's men could even clear leather. He leveled the gun directly at the face of the closest Corsican guard. The velvet doors burst open. Victor's men flooded the room, assault rifles raised, forming a wall of steel between Victor and the remaining Corsicans. "Drop them," Victor ordered, his voice echoing in the small room. The Corsican guards froze, looking at the tactical disadvantage, and slowly raised their hands, stepping away from their fallen boss. Clara was pressed back into her chair, her heart hammering against her ribs, staring at the violence that had erupted in a fraction of a second. She had negotiated peace for months. She had used words to build bridges. But in 3 seconds, Victor had reminded her exactly what kind of world they lived in. Victor stood over Morrow, who was groaning on the floor, clutching his bleeding head. The French syndicate leader was covered in shattered crystal and wine, his aristocratic facade entirely destroyed. Victor looked down at him, the gun still gripped loosely in his hand. Tell him, Victor said, his eyes never leaving Marrow, his voice cold enough to freeze hell. Clara stood up. Her legs were shaking, but she forced herself to walk to the edge of the table. She looked down at the bleeding man. She didn't use the polite diplomatic French. She used the gutter dialect he had used on her. Mr. Hale says, Clara translated, her voice ringing clear in the shocked silence of the room, that the tariff remains at its current rate, and if you ever speak to his translator again, he will rip out your tongue and feed it to you. Marrow stared up at her, blood leaking into his eye, sheer terror replacing the arrogance. He managed a weak, frantic nod. Victor holstered his weapon. He didn't look back at the guards. He walked over to Clara, grabbed her firmly by the elbow, and steered her out of the dining room. They walked in silence through the opulent halls of the restaurant, Victor's guards trailing close behind. Clara's mind was racing, the adrenaline making her lightheaded. When they finally reached the armored SUV waiting in the alley, Victor shoved her inside and climbed in after her. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing them in the quiet, leather-scented interior. The driver threw the car into gear, speeding away from the curb. Clara sat as far away from Victor as the seat allowed. She was staring at his hands. There was a smear of Marrow's blood on his right cuff. You almost started a war, Clara whispered, her voice trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. You shattered a treaty over an insult. You told me business always comes first. You told me ego gets people killed. Victor slowly turned his head to look at her. The violent feral energy of the room had vanished, replaced by an intense, suffocating gravity. He didn't insult my ego, Clara, Victor said softly. He threatened what is mine. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and irretractable. He wasn't talking about his logistics network. He wasn't talking about his bank accounts. Clara looked into his eyes and realized with a terrifying clarity that the $25,000 a week had never been a salary. It was a purchase price. She had stepped out of the shadows to save his empire, and in doing so she had become the most valuable, heavily guarded and dangerous possession in it, and heaven helped the man who tried to take her from him. The flight back from Montreal was completely silent. Victor didn't drink. Clara didn't open her laptop. She sat staring at the bulkhead, feeling the vibration of the jet engines deep in her teeth. The blood on Victor's cuff had dried to a dark, rusted brown. It felt like a stain on the air itself. When they finally arrived at the penthouse, the city was just beginning to wake up. Gray morning light spilled across the hardwood floors. Victor dismissed the detail at the door with a sharp wave of his hand. They were alone. Clara dropped her leather portfolio onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a heavy smack. She kicked off her heels. She didn't care about the professionalism anymore. She was exhausted, terrified, and furious. I am not a possession, Clara said to the empty room. Victor was pouring a glass of water at the wet bar. He stopped. He didn't turn around. You don't own me, Victor, she continued, her voice rising, shaking off the forced calm she had maintained for the last 6 hours. You bought my debt. You pay my salary. You provide security. That buys my time. That buys my translations. It does not buy my autonomy. If you treat me like a piece of property in front of those men, you strip away the only armor I have. Victor set the glass down. He turned slowly. The feral energy from the restaurant was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Mo didn't see you as property, Victor said softly. He saw you as my throat, and he tried to cut it. He was trying to get a reaction, and he got one. Victor walked across the room, closing the distance between them until he was standing less than a foot away. He towered over her, but he didn't crowd her. He just stood there, looking down at her bare feet on the hardwood, then up to her face. You think I wanted to shatter a bottle over a Corsican's head? You think I wanted to jeopardize a $70 million supply line? I didn't have a choice, Clara. You always have a choice. You told me ego gets people killed. It wasn't ego. Victor's voice dropped. It was a rough, quiet sound that scraped against the quiet of the room. In this business, weakness is blood in the water. If I let another man speak to you like that, if I let him look at you like that without consequences, every syndicate from here to Sicily will know exactly how to break me. Clara stared at him, her chest tightened. Because I'm your translator. No, Victor said. He reached up, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair away from her face. His knuckles grazed her cheek, his skin was rough, calloused, freezing cold. Because you are the only thing in my life I actually care about keeping alive. The confession hung in the air. It wasn't a romance novel declaration. It was a grim, tactical fact. He was a man who lived in a fortress of violence and paranoia, and she had somehow walked straight through the walls. Clara Ara didn't pull away from his touch. She leaned into it just a fraction of an inch. You're making us both targets. I am making us untouchable, Victor corrected. Go to sleep, Clara Ara. We have a meeting with the Irish tomorrow. She watched him walk away, disappearing down the long shadowed hallway. She touched her own cheek where his fingers had been. It was a terrifying realization. She had stepped out of the background to save his money, but somewhere along the way she had become his reason for making it. Simon was sweating again. It was a cold, wet afternoon in Chicago. The safe house was an abandoned meatpacking plant on the south side, retrofitted with steel doors and acoustic dampening. The smell of old iron and ammonia lingered in the walls. Across the steel table sat Frank Sullivan. Frank was old-school Irish mob. He wore a tweed suit that smelled of cigar smoke and expensive gin. He didn't use interpreters. He spoke English, but he spoke it in circles, hiding his true intentions behind layers of working-class charm and veiled threats. Victor sat entirely still. Clara Ara sat to his right, a notepad blank. She didn't need to translate languages today. She needed to translate intent. We appreciate you making the trip, Victor, Frank said, smiling widely. He had dead flat eyes. The logistics disruption in Boston has been a headache for us all. We just want to make sure the new routing fees are equitable. The fees are standard, Frank, Victor said. 20% on the haul. We handle the local unions. Right, standard. Frank tapped his cigar on an ashtray. He glanced past Victor, making the briefest, almost imperceptible eye contact with Simon, who was standing by the door. Clara caught it. Her stomach dropped. It was a micro-expression, a quiet understanding between two men who were not supposed to have an understanding. She began replaying the last 3 weeks of Simon's behavior. The nervous sweating, the discrepancies in the Chicago ledgers he had dismissed as rounding errors. Simon had been the one pushing for this sit-down. Simon had insisted on this specific warehouse because it was off the grid. Simon, Clara said quietly. Simon jumped. Yes, Clara. Did you bring the revised union contracts? The ones stipulating the Boston dock worker payouts? Simon blinked, pale and rigid. They're in the car. I didn't think we needed them until the second round of negotiations. Frank Sullivan smiled. No need for paperwork just yet, sweetheart. We're just having a chat among friends. Clara looked at Frank's hands. He was tapping his cigar, but he wasn't smoking it. His weight was shifted onto the balls of his feet. His 2 guards by the door hadn't blinked in 2 minutes. They were bracing. This wasn't a negotiation, it was an execution. Simon had sold Victor out. The missing money in the ledgers wasn't a mistake. It was a skim. Simon had been bleeding Victor's accounts. And now that Clara was auditing the international contracts, he was going to be caught. Sullivan was going to kill Victor, take over the eastern seaboard, and Simon would walk away wealthy and safe. Clara didn't have time to write a note. She didn't have time to whisper. Victor, Clara said, her voice sharp and perfectly clear. Victor looked at her. The German contract, Clara said, staring directly into Victor's eyes. It was a code they hadn't established, but one she desperately hoped his paranoid mind would understand. The one where Klaus Richter requested a blind reconciliation. Victor's eyes widened a fraction of a millimeter. He remembered the exact phrasing. A blind reconciliation. An ambush. Clara kicked Victor's shin hard under the table and dove out of her chair. Victor didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. His survival instincts were hardwired into his spine. As Clara hit the concrete floor, Victor flipped the heavy steel table upward with a massive roar, using it as a shield, just as Frank Sullivan pulled a suppressed pistol from his coat. Swip, swip, swip. Bullets tore into the steel table, ringing out like warped church bells. Victor drew his weapon mid-dive, rolling over the shattered chairs. He fired twice. Frank's chest exploded in a spray of red. The Irish boss hit the ground before his cigar stopped rolling across the floor. The 2 guards opened fire. Concrete dust exploded around Clara's head. She covered her ears, pressing herself flat against the frozen, filthy floor, screaming as the deafening roar of gunfire filled the small room. Victor moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. He didn't panic. He shot the first guard in the throat. The second guard turned to run, but Victor put 2 rounds through the back of his knee, sending him crashing into the wall. The room went dead silent. The smell of cordite and copper filled the air. Clara opened her eyes. Simon was standing by the door. He had a small handgun pulled from his waistband. His hands were shaking so violently, he could barely hold it straight. He was pointing it at Victor's back. Victor was out of ammunition, his slide locked back. He froze, realizing the danger behind him. Don't, Simon sobbed, aiming at Victor. I had to. You were going to find out. She was going to find out. Clara didn't think. She reached out, her fingers wrapping around the heavy crystal ashtray that had fallen from the table. She scrambled to her knees. Simon, Clara said. Simon flinched, glancing at her for a split second. It was enough. Victor dropped his empty gun, pulled a tactical blade from his belt, and closed the distance in 2 strides. He drove the knife into Simon's shoulder, pinning him against the steel door. Simon screamed, dropping the gun. Victor ripped the blade out and threw Simon to the floor. He pressed his boot into Simon's throat, cutting off his air. Victor looked back at Clara. She was still on her knees, clutching the bloody ashtray to her chest, a charcoal suit covered in concrete dust. She was hyperventilating, staring at the bodies on the floor. Victor kicked Simon's gun away. He walked over to Clara, holstering his empty weapon. He knelt in the debris. He didn't offer her a hand. He just waited until she looked up at him. You translated that perfectly. Victor breathed, his chest heaving slightly. Clara let out a choked laugh, dropping the ashtray. Her hands were shaking violently. You owe me a new suit. I'll buy you the whole tailor, Victor said. He reached out, his bloody hands framing her face. He pulled her forward and pressed his forehead against hers. It was an anchor in the storm. Are you hit? No, she whispered. Good. Victor stood up, pulling her with him. He didn't let go of her hand. He turned to look at Simon, who was coughing up blood on the floor, weeping openly. Clara, Victor said, his voice returning to the dead, flat tone of a CEO looking at a bad investment. Call the cleanup crew. Tell them we need a deep scrub in Chicago. Then call the Irish lieutenants in Boston. Tell them their boss just retired and I am their new point of contact. The transition of power was brutal, efficient, and entirely linguistic. With Frank Sullivan dead and Simon buried in a landfill outside Gary, Indiana, Victor's empire threatened to destabilize. The wolves smelled blood. The Russian Bratzer, the German syndicates, the French Corsicans, they all waited for the American king to falter. Instead, they received a phone call. It was a Tuesday night. Victor was sitting in his penthouse study, a fresh bandage wrapped tight around his ribs from a bruised lung he took during the Chicago fallout. He was pale, relying heavily on painkillers and scotch. He physically could not attend the video summits. He could barely sit upright. Clara Barada sat behind his massive mahogany desk. She wore a stark white suit. Her hair was pulled back. She looked like an executioner in a corporate boardroom. The encrypted monitor on the wall displayed a grid of 6 faces, the heads of the most dangerous crime families on 3 continents. Anton Volov, Klaus Richter, Alam Morrow, sporting a massive bandage over his right eye, and 3 others. Victor sat in a leather armchair in the shadows of the room just out of frame of the camera. He was watching her. Clara leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. She didn't look at a notebook. She didn't look at a script. Gentlemen, Clara began in English. Her voice was ice cold. Mr. Hale sends his regards. He is currently indisposed, restructuring the Chicago territory following a hostile acquisition. Volov scoffed on screen. He spoke in Russian. We do not negotiate with the mouthpiece. Put Hale on the screen, or the shipping lanes shut down at midnight. Clara didn't turn to Victor. She didn't ask for permission. She looked directly into the camera and answered Volov in perfect razor-sharp Russian. Mr. Hale is busy counting the money he took from the Irish. If you shut down the shipping lanes at midnight, Mr. Volov, I will personally route the Baltic customs authorities to inspect your next 3 shipments of steel. You will lose $40 million by sunrise. Do we understand each other? Volkov went perfectly silent. The subtle threat delivered with absolute unflinching authority in his native tongue hit him like a physical blow. He slowly nodded on the screen. Clara switched to German, addressing Rita. Richter, the blind reconciliation will continue in Hamburg. We have increased your distribution fee to 12% as a show of good faith following the recent turbulence. RTOR looked impressed. He offered a curt, respectful nod. She switched to French, staring dead at Morrow. She didn't use the polite dialect, she used the gutter slang he understood. And you? The Montreal tariff remains at 20%. If you breathe a word of complaint, the next bottle doesn't hit your eye, it hits your throat. Comprise? Morrow swallowed hard. Comprise. Excellent. Clara said, switching back to English, addressing the entire grid. The network is secure, the money flows on schedule. Mr. Hale expects your quarterly reports by Friday. Good evening. She cut the feed. The screen went black. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. Clara sat behind the desk, her heart beating a steady, powerful rhythm. She wasn't shaking, she wasn't terrified, the fear had burned out of her weeks ago, leaving behind something entirely new, something dangerous. She heard the soft clink of a glass. Victor stood up from the shadows. He walked slowly to the desk, holding 2 glasses of scotch. He set one down in front of her. He didn't look angry that she had spoken for him. He didn't look threatened by her power. He looked at her the way a starving man looks at a feast. You threatened to burn 40 million of Russian steel, Victor said quietly. I knew Vulov was bluffing, Clara replied, picking up the heavy crystal glass. He overextended on his warehouse leases last month. He can't afford a customs raid. I leveraged his debt. Victor leaned over the desk. He placed his hands flat on the polished wood. You are terrifying, Clara Bennett. I learned from a very effective teacher. Victor reached across the desk. He took the glass out of her hand, setting it aside. He grasped her wrists, gently pulling her up from the chair. Clara didn't resist. She let him pull her around the edge of the desk until she was pressed against him. The smell of his cologne, sharp and metallic, wrapped around her. His hands slid up her arms, resting on her shoulders. I don't need a translator anymore, Victor murmured, his mouth inches from hers. They hear you perfectly. Then what do you need? Clara whispered, looking up into eyes as dark and deep as an ocean trench. A partner, Victor said. Someone to help me hold the leash. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle romantic kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate, heavy and bruised, built on shared trauma and absolute trust. Clara's hands tangled in his shirt, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the only man in the world who understood the exact weight of the crown they were both wearing. Blood and bullets built the empire, but it was her voice that would keep it. If this story gripped you, don't leave just yet. The underworld is full of secrets, and this channel is your VIP pass to the best crime dramas, intense romances, and suspenseful stories on the internet. Hit that like button if you loved Clara's transformation from an invisible maid to the most powerful voice in the mafia. Share this video with someone who loves a dark, thrilling romance, and make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next upload. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken Victor's deal? See you in the next story.